There is a particular kind of silence that begins to grow in the marrow of a woman when the external fire of another's touch is extinguished for a long duration. It is not the silence of a room where the music has simply stopped. It is the silence of a cathedral after the congregation has left, where the air itself seems to thicken with the weight of unseen architecture. At first, the absence is a hunger, a sharp-edged ghost that sits at the table and demands to be fed, pointing toward the world of skin and heat. But as the months turn into a season, and the season into a cycle of years, the hunger transmutes. It ceases to be a cry for the other and begins to function as a mirror. The skin, no longer a bridge to another's country, becomes a border. It becomes the vessel for pressure that has nowhere to go but inward, pushing against the walls of the ego until the foundations begin to groan and shift. This silence has a texture, like raw silk or the dust that dances in a single beam of light in a room that hasn't been opened in a decade. It settles on the furniture of the mind, softening the sharp corners of memory and expectation. The woman finds herself standing in the center of this quiet, listening not for a knock at the door, but for the sound of her own blood moving through the labyrinth of her veins. It is a terrifyingly intimate sound. When the world stops asking for her body begins to ask things of her. It asks where the heat goes when it isn't shared. It asks why the air feels heavier on her bare arms than it did when she was younger. The silence becomes a presence in itself, a third entity in the room, watching her move from the bed to the window, from the window to the mirror. It is a slow, methodical reclamation of territory. Every inch of her skin that was once defined by the hands of another is now being remapped by the atmosphere alone. She begins to notice the way the cool air of a hallway feels like a garment, or how the sun hitting the back of her neck in a garden carries a weight that is almost structural. The absence of the other is not a void, it is a saturation. It is the experience of being completely poured back into oneself, until the vessel is full to the brim with its own essence. As the weeks dissolve into a formless stretch of autonomy, something subtle and tectonic begins to shift beneath the surface of the daily routine. The perception of time loses its linear, frantic quality. It no longer feels like a countdown to an encounter or a recovery from one. Instead, time becomes circular, rhythmic, and strangely spacious. She notices the way the morning light crawls across the floorboards, hitting a specific knot in the wood at exactly 10 in the morning. And she realizes she has the capacity to watch it for an hour without the nagging feeling that she should be preparing herself for someone else's gaze. The body, freed from the performance of being desired, begins to exist in a state of raw, unedited being. She finds herself touching the fabric of her own sleeve with a new kind of curiosity, or noticing the intricate, blue vein map on the back of her hand, as if seeing a foreign landscape for the first time. There is a strange, quiet dignity that emerges in the way she brushes her hair or pours tea. These actions are no longer preludes to a shared life, but complete rituals in themselves. The mind begins to sharpen its focus on the minute. The sound of a clock ticking in the next room becomes a rhythmic heartbeat that she syncs her own breathing to. The smell of rain on dry pavement, the temperature carries a charge that is almost erotic in its intensity, yet it remains purely internal. A secret conversation between her senses and the earth. She is no longer missing being touched. She is beginning to fear how much she is starting to enjoy the sensation of being untouched. The skin becomes a sensitive instrument, picking up the vibrations of the house, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant roar of the city, all of it filtered to a mind that is becoming increasingly transparent. She feels like a house that has been emptied of its furniture, only to reveal the exquisite beauty of its bones and the way the light plays in the empty corners. The psyche, however, does not remain a passive observer of this physical stillness. When the outward path of the erotic impulse, the energy that seeks to connect, to merge, to lose oneself in the other is blocked, it does not simply vanish. It is a law of the inner world that energy must go somewhere. Denied the skin of the other, the libido turns back upon itself like a river dam, beginning to flood the subterranean caves of the subconscious. This is when the dreams change. They lose their mundane quality and become lush, cinematic, and terrifyingly vivid. She finds herself navigating ancient, dark hallways where the walls are made of living velvet, or standing on the edge of a great, black lake that pulses with a rhythmic, subterranean tide. These dreams are not about sex in any conventional sense. They are about the raw, undifferentiated power of the creative force itself. Girl figures begin to emerge from the mist. There is often a shadow figure, a silent observer who stands at the periphery of her dreamscapes, a hunter, a gardener, or a monk representing the aspects of her own strength that she used to project onto men. Because she is not giving her power away in exchange for intimacy, she is forced to confront it in its primal form. This inner masculine with animus begins to demand an accounting. He appears in her thoughts as a sudden, sharp clarity, a cold wind that blows through her emotional attachments and leaves her standing in a landscape of stark, beautiful truth. The fantasies she indulges in are no longer about being rescued or even being held. They are about transformation. She imagines herself turning into stone, into water, into a bird of prey. The mind is trying to find a language for the intensity of its own isolation. It is manufacturing its own heat, its own friction. She begins to realize that the other she was searching for in the world was always a ghost of this internal figure, and that the union she craved was not with a body, but with this hidden architecture of her own soul. There is a profound danger in this stage of the journey, a threshold where the silence can turn from a sanctuary into a prison. If the woman remains unconscious of what is happening, if she views her celibacy as a failure or a mere waiting room, the mind can begin to grow a protective, icy shell. This is the risk of the emotional fortress. Without the softening influence of physical intimacy, the ego can become overly rigid, convinced of its own absolute self-sufficiency. She may find herself becoming judgmental of the messiness of others' lives, viewing the desire of her friends as a form of weakness she has evolved past. This is a delusion of the shadow. The heart, when not exercised in the vulnerability of touch, can start to shrink. She might find herself becoming obsessed with order, with the perfection of her surroundings, using her solitude as a way to control the universe so that nothing can ever surprise or wound her again. The projection onto the world becomes one of sterility. She looks at the pulsing, breathing world and sees only chaos. Her inner life becomes a hall of mirrors where she only talks to versions of herself, and the internal figures, the hunter, the monk, become jailers rather than guides. She starts to feel like a diamond, hard, brilliant, and utterly cold. The mind begins to treat the body like an inconvenient animal that must be disciplined and silenced, rather than a partner in the experience of living. This is the death of the feminine receptivity. She becomes the ice queen of her own psyche, sitting on a throne of pure logic and self-control, wondering why, despite her perfect autonomy, she feels as though she is disappearing. The world starts to feel thin, like a movie set where the colors are fading. She is no longer in the world. She is observing it through a thick pane of glass, untouched and untouchable. But if she catches herself in this hardening, if she allows the silence to be a teacher rather than a shield, a second transformation occurs. This is the psychological alchemy of the process. The energy that was previously used to maintain the fortress is suddenly released into perception. She begins to see with a depth that is almost painful. Because she is not looking for a partner to complete her, she sees people as they actually are, in all their flawed, tragic, and beautiful singularity. Her creativity, no longer tied to the need for external validation, begins to bloom in strange, nocturnal ways. She might find herself writing, painting, or simply thinking with a clarity that feels like a superpower. The erotic energy has been sublimated. It has risen from the loins to the eyes and the mind. The world becomes saturated with the hidden meaning. Every object she touches, every meal she prepares, becomes an act of devotion to the mystery of her own existence. She realizes that the freedom she felt earlier was only the beginning. The real goal is sovereignty. A sovereign does not need to shut out the world to feel powerful. A sovereign is so rooted in her own center that she can let the world in without losing herself. The longing for another does not disappear, but it loses its frantic, starving quality. It becomes a holy longing, a reminder of her humanity, a thin silver thread that keeps her connected to the earth while her mind explores the stars. She begins to find an immense, quiet joy in the small things, the way the water feels on her skin in the bath, the weight of a heavy book in her lap, the specific shade of indigo in the sky just before the sun disappears. These are no longer compensations for a lack. They are the substance of a life that is being lived from the inside out. She eventually arrives at a state of being that is difficult to describe to those who are still caught in the frantic dance of seeking and finding. It is a state of radiant solitude. She is no longer a woman without something. She is a woman who has become something. The mind has finally integrated the absence. The body is no longer a site of lack, but a site of presence. She moves through the world with a quiet, heavy grace, like a mountain that doesn't need to move to be felt. The people around her sense at this strange, magnetic stillness. They are drawn to her because she is one of the few who is not asking anything of them. She has become her own source of heat. The internal figures have settled into their proper places. The hunter is now her discernment. The monk is her peace. The gardener is her self-care. She has conducted a wedding within herself, a union of her own masculine and feminine energies, and the sex she is having is with life itself. Every breath is emerging with the atmosphere. Every thought is a flirtation with the infinite. She knows that she could invite someone back into her space at any time, but the requirement for entry has changed. They would have to be as comfortable with the silence as she is. They would have to be a person who doesn't come to fill a hole, but to share a landscape. As she sits in the darkening room, watching the shadows lengthen, she is not lonely. She is vast. She is a world unto herself, a finished work of art that is still, somehow, in the process of being painted. The silence is no longer a cathedral. It is a home. And in this home she is finally, completely, and hauntingly awake. The journey into this state is not a straight line. It is a spiral that constantly circles back to the body. Even in the depths of her psychological transformation, the woman remains a creature of flesh and blood. There are nights when the physical reality of her isolation returns with a sudden, sharp clarity. She might be lying in bed, the sheets cool and crisp, and suddenly feel the immense weight of the empty space beside her. In these moments, the mind doesn't reach for a fantasy or a memory. Instead, it sinks deeper into the sensation of the bed, the pressure of the mattress against her spine, the sound of her own rhythmic breathing. She learns to parent her own desire, to hold the longing in her mind without letting it drown her. This is a sophisticated form of psychological endurance. It is the ability to sit in the fire of one's own unmet needs and not run away into distraction. She begins to see that most of human culture is a massive, noisy distraction from this very quiet, very simple reality of being alone in one's skin. By refusing the easy escapes, she gains access to a level of consciousness that is denied to those who are constantly seeking reflection in the eyes of another. She becomes a witness to the thing in itself. A tree is no longer a backdrop for a romantic walk. It is an ancient, rooted entity with a life entirely independent of her. A stone is a miracle of duration. This objectivity, born of solitude, gives her a sense of peace that is not dependent on circumstances. It is the peace of the desert, of the deep ocean, of the high peaks where the air is too thin for most to breathe. As she navigates this high-altitude life, her relationship with other women also begins to change. She looks at her friends who are deeply enmeshed in the dramas of partnership with a mixture of compassion and a strange, distant recognition. She remembers the frantic energy of that world, the way the mind becomes a satellite orbiting the moods and desires of the husband, the lover, the child. She sees the beauty in it, but she also sees the cost, the way the internal landscape can become overgrown with the weeds of another's expectations. In her own mind, the garden is well tended. There are no weeds because there is no one else there to plant them. She has become the sole architect of her inner peace. This can make her seem other to those around her. She might speak less, but when she does, her words carry the weight of someone who has spent a long time in the silence. She doesn't offer advice. She offers a presence that is a challenge to the status quo. Her existence is a quiet question. Who are you when no one is looking at you? What remains of you when the mirrors are all removed? She becomes a mirror herself, reflecting back to the world the parts of itself that it has forgotten. The final shift occurs when the woman stops defining herself by her celibacy altogether. It is no longer a condition or a phase. It simply is. The mind has reached a point of equilibrium, where the presence or absence of a sexual partner is no longer the central axis around which her identity revolves. She has moved beyond the binary of attached or unattached. She is simply present. In this state, the erotic energy has become totally diffused into her general awareness. It is in the way she walks, the way she thinks, the way she listens to a stranger tell a story. This is the true meaning of wholeness. It is not the absence of desire, but the expansion of it until it covers the entire world. She is in a state of constant, low-grade intimacy with everything. The light on the wall is her lover. The wind in the trees is her touch. The silence of the night is her sanctuary. She has discovered that the mind, when left to its own devices, is not a desert but a garden. It only requires the courage to stay until the rain comes. And when it does, the bloom is unlike anything that can be found in the world of the two. It is a solitary flower, opening in the dark, breathing for no one but itself, yet filling the entire house with a scent that smells like home. She is the bride of the abyss, and she has found that the abyss is not empty, it is overflowing with her own radiant, unborrowed life. As she moves into the later stages of this psychological arrival, the boundaries between her inner and outer worlds begin to soften. It is no longer a matter of going inside to find her peace. The peace now precedes her. When she walks into a room, the silence she has cultivated follows her like an invisible cloak. This isn't a heavy or somber silence. It's an expectant one, a silence that feels like the moment just before a symphony begins. She finds that she can navigate the chaos of the outside world, the noise of traffic, the frantic energy of the marketplace, the emotional turbulence of others, without losing the thread of her own internal melody. The inner figures that once felt like separate archetypes have now become integrated parts of her personality. She no longer needs to dream of the hunter to feel her own strength. She feels it in the steady grip of her hand on a steering wheel. She no longer needs to imagine the monk to find stillness. She finds it in the space between two heartbeats while waiting in line at the grocery store. The psychological mechanism that once turned her desire inward has now become a permanent lens of perception. This lens reveals the Eros in everything. She sees the eroticism in the way a vine clings to a brick wall, the way a river carves its path through stone, the way a storm breaks over a parched field. This is not a sexualized view of the world, but a life force view. She recognizes the same pulse that once drove her toward the body of another is the same pulse that drives the stars through the heavens. This realization brings with it a profound sense of safety. If the same force that moves the universe is moving through her, she can never truly be lost or alone. The longing that was once a sharp pain has evolved into a sense of belonging. She belongs to the process of life itself. She is a cell in the body of the world, functioning perfectly in her own quiet corner. This state changes her perception of aging as well. For many women, the passage of time is seen as a loss of erotic capital, a slow fading from the gaze of the world. But for the woman who has found her own inner heat, aging is seen as a process of refinement. She is shedding the superficial layers of her identity to reveal the core. Each wrinkle is a line in a poem she has written with her life. Her body is not a decaying object. It is a ripening one. She feels more beautiful now than she did when she was 20, because her beauty is no longer a performance for an audience. It is an internal glow, a quality of light that comes from having processed her own darkness. She is not fading out. She is fading into the essential truth of herself. The mind becomes a vast library of these refined sensations, a place where she can wander at will, pulling memories from the shelves not to mourn them, but to appreciate their color and texture. The arrival is not a destination where she stops growing. It is the discovery of the ground upon which she can grow forever. She has reached the still point of the turning world, as the poet said. From this point, she can watch the seasons of her own life with a sense of wonder and detachment. She knows that there may be seasons of connection in her future and seasons of even deeper solitude. But the terror of the empty space is gone. She has filled that space with the substance of her own consciousness. She has proven to herself that she can survive the absence of the other. And in that survival, she has found a self that is indestructible. She sits in her chair as the evening light fades to a deep velvety blue. She doesn't turn on the lamp. She sits in the dark, perfectly comfortable, perfectly still. The house is quiet, but she is not. Inside her, 1,000 voices are singing in harmony, the voices of her past, her future, her strength, and her vulnerability. She is a woman alone in a room, and she is an entire civilization. She is the silence, and she is the song. She is finally, irrevocably her own.